Okay, so I'm going to talk to you. I actually changed the title a wee bit to give away the punchline. So the original title of the program said, Fruits of Failure, Preserving the Records of Failed Entrepreneurial Ventures, and I put in email, because I'm going to submit that saving email is our best opportunity to actually collect the relevant digital records of entrepreneurial ventures that don't otherwise organize their records for archivists to save. Touching upon all the problems that Bob highlighted for us over lunch. So just quickly, kind of where I'm coming from, I've done some work in digital humanities, so I see this as kind of part of a digital humanities project, thinking a lot about business history archives, how to identify and preserve the business records of historic value and importance. I'm also an entrepreneurship researcher, so I'm trying to think about how do we study entrepreneurship and how do the business archives that we do assemble contribute to management science. And finally, for whatever reasons, I study failure. I studied failed industries, failed companies. It's just what I do. And talk to my analyst. So the particular project I'll talk to you about today, the motivation is trying to think about connecting business records, archives, with what folks in management research would call data. Trying to establish consilience, a 19th century term about the unity and coherence of knowledge systems between business history and management research and entrepreneurship. So I'm trying to connect these two things together. And I did a little bit of this before. Andrew was kind enough to mention my work on the Business Plan Archive, which was an effort to collect a series of business plans from the dot-com era, use them for management science, and now save them, hand them off to the Library of Congress, and I don't know, maybe scholars even in this room have used those records. That would be terrific. So this is sort of a new project along those lines, trying to build this consilience between archives and management research. Here's the outline. So talk a little bit about business records. I'll talk about a particular process of failure, a certain way that firms can fail, and how we can potentially exploit that failure to generate samples and records of failed firms. And I'm going to give you I already kind of gave it away, but I have one big bet. My big bet is that with email, if we have a relatively complete email collection of a failed entrepreneurial venture, we can answer most of the questions that scholars will want to ask of that firm. We'll be able to tell its history. We'll be able to look at its social networks. We'll be able to look at resource flows, interorganizational questions. We can do most of that if we have a relatively complete copy of the email. And I have some conjectures. I doubt I'll get time for those. So that's why they're in brackets. So just a sort of jumping off point. This was my former colleague, Christine Borgman at UCLA when I was there. This nice book about scholarship in the digital age. She said, while the new technologies receive the most attention, it's the underlying social and policy changes that are the most profound and that will have the most lasting effects on the future scholarly environment. So a lot of times we focus on the technology because that's, we see ERP systems and we see all the technology before us. But her point is that how that technology affects the way we manage information. And that has to do much more with how our expectations and norms are adjusting to the technological changes than just the technology itself. So kind of keep that in mind, because you'll see that's really the challenge is how firms are changing their behavior. Okay. So quickly, the business, the record of business at risk. This is a kind of a graph that basically visualizes what Bob said in his talk. So you can imagine a notional record produced very close to the time of production. The probability of it persisting, being accessible, discoverable, is quite high. And over time, that declines because 3 moves equals a fire, or records are used or misplaced, they're managed in various ways. And so you can imagine technology, organization, institutions affect the slope of that line. And we could think of historians being way out here as sort of the residual claimants on this process of records management inside the firm. And I have a picture of some old musty books, because this is the model for the paper archive. And if we migrate this to the digital archive, we still have, the same thing happens, the same process is in place. But the question is, what does making it digital do to the slope of those lines? Right? And in particular, if we have things like retention periods. So a lot of firms will have things like retention schedule. We're going to save these records for a certain period of time. Well, what that means is, for some time, the records are more likely to persist. But then after that date, after the retention period, then the likelihood of their persisting decreases. And we can imagine that process in an even more extreme setting as we get into, start thinking about knowledge management practices inside firms. The reason firms invest in knowledge management infrastructure is because they want to use their records. They think their records are valuable for their operations. So they're going to be even more likely to persist in the short term. But if they were valuable, as soon as they stop being valuable, they're going to destroy them, because then they are merely a risk, a burden, a cost. So the goal of knowledge management, in some sense, is zero residual out here. Right? A firm actually doesn't really have a public interest in turning over a lot of valuable records once they're no longer useful to the firm. Unless we give them something for it. If we can give them a tax credit or certain sorts of benefits, then maybe we could. But in kind of state of nature, the firm wants there to be nothing left at the end of the day. So that's the situation. Now, when we think about big firms, Alfred Chandler's, strategy and structure, the Fortune 500, the Toronto 60, what have you. Maybe that situation we can kind of negotiate with it a little bit. But when we think about entrepreneurial capitalism and the rise of all these startups, I can tell you startups come and go, right? So modal survival, 5-year survival rate is, about 50%. So lots of startups just fail. And records are not high on startups' priorities. If you talk to an entrepreneur, records management, way down at the bottom. And we know that the knowledge management is only going to make those records valuable for a limited period of time. And there's no fiduciary obligation of the corporation to the public. It's just the nexus of contracts. It just owes its responsibility to its shareholders, not its stakeholders. You could argue about that, but so this was just from a paper I wrote a few years ago, and it said, in the past, business records survived inadvertently. The digital revolution, consistent with changes in the structure of the economy, the clearest dictates of shareholder capitalism, will destroy the record of business, not by accident, but on purpose. by making it manageable and valuable for a discrete but limited period of time, beyond which its value to the corporation falls below the cost to maintain it. On that day, the record of business will be erased. So that was my conclusion about 8 years ago, based on that first project that Andrew talked about, business plan archive. So and I think my findings stand up okay. Here I am 8 years later. I don't feel the need to revisit this. I think this is still what's happening in the world. So what does that mean? I draw a few implications for you here. I call them sort of anti-Whig implications. Right? The Whig history was always, right, the victors, to the victors go the spoils, the victors get to write the history. And in fact, what we may be dealing with now is that surviving firms retain the power to destroy their records, whereas failing firms lose this power. Therefore, let's focus on failed firms. This was exactly what Bob was saying. Well, we don't. If a firm comes to us and they're healthy, manage your own records. But if you're failing, okay, let's get in there. What can we do? And here are a couple opportunities to do that. So, bankruptcy. I've dealt with the records of big headaches over records of a failed law firm because of confidentiality and privilege and some other things. Public workouts. I was furious that the U.S. Congress bailed out General Motors and didn't even get the records in exchange. Anyway, but there's this one opportunity to what I call venture workouts. So these are failed venture-backed firms. And if you're curious about what happens when a venture capital-backed firm begins to fail, often it does not go through public bankruptcy. So there are these private consulting firms that the VCs hire to do what's called a private workout, a venture workout. And they do something called assignment for the benefit of creditors. So they wrap all the nexus of contracts into a new firm. The consulting firm manages that process and owns all of the records. So they try and salvage some value, minimize the loss, maybe sell some intellectual property, but they end up with a bunch of records. And so what we've been doing is working with one of the leading workout firms to try and get them to give us those records. And in particular, we've worked with them on paper records as well, but in particular, focusing on email. How am I doing? We'll see. So anyway, this is kind of an interesting process, and we could, if people have questions about the venture workouts, we can come back to it. This is kind of a schematic of it. So the consulting firm consolidates the records from lots of failed firms and stores them in various ways. Paper records, hard drives, all sorts of stuff. And that's what brings me to email. So remember I said I had this one simple hypothesis, right? Email can tell us about startup history. With a relatively complete email archive, a scholar can ask and answer most important historical questions about a startup. So that's my hypothesis. And the little chart there shows you, email is still pretty important. Some people are starting to move away from email, and so I'm sure there will be a time when, just like telegraphs cease to be informative, or letters, people stopped writing letters for business purposes. But 2017, we're at about 5 billion email accounts worldwide. That's 4.9 billion. There's a lot of email going around out there. So this humble, almost pathetically primitive technology known as electronic mail. That might be exactly the humble, pathetic, very basic container that we as archivists can actually manage and possibly work with. So the top row there is, ongoing firms generate email. And the question is, will we ever see it? So down below is the process that happens with the failed firms. So the firm fails, it loses control of its records, it gets aggregated and stabilized by this, either, I put the name of the firm, I should have taken that out. Pretend you didn't see that. That's the consulting firm that we work with. And then they stabilize that email collection, process it into a usable format, and then researchers can access it. So that's the workflow model that we're trying to build. And this is a sample collection that we released a couple years ago. Avocado is the name of the collection. It's a pseudonym for a failed venture-backed firm. This research collection is available from the Linguistic Data Consortium at the University of Pennsylvania. Many of our universities are members of that consortium. And so you can sign up to access the full processed email collection. And again, it just looks, so what we did is we did some risk assessment, we did a little bit of redaction just for the passports, credit cards, personal ID, a little bit of anonymization. We did have an IRB approval, and there's some particular forms that users have to sign to access it. But again, this is the native email. This is not just the headers or the footers or timestamped or anonymized or blended word things. These are the actual emails, full of context, the full thread, everything. So, and if you think the collection statistics here, so we started with about 2 million objects. By the time you do some redaction, take out some attachments, things that you can't read, we did some risk minimization around that. You end up with about 974,000 emails. So again, my supposition, my hypothesis to you is that if you are a historian of that firm, which I can't name today, but you'll be able to name soon, you could tell any story you want about that firm using those 974,000 emails. And, oh my goodness, yeah, I'm not going there. Forget it. So just a few conjectures. The kinds of questions we could think about for management science would be things like the organizational life cycle, looking for revenue moments, thinking about tenor, use of emotional words, network structures. So these are all things that we can extract from the email. And I'm now up to 5 companies. So we've gone from 1 to 5. I view that as progress. What I will say is even these 5 companies, each one is different. So we had an NSF grant to support that avocado IT project, and we ended up spending about 18 months to develop a system that could read that email and de-thread it, get rid of the attachments, look for the dirty pictures, all that stuff. And now the next 3 are all different. The next 4 are all different. Some of them use Gmail. Some of them used Outlook. Some of them used weird tar formats that I spend most of my time actually looking up bizarre file extensions on Wikipedia. What is that file extension? So, gotta wrap up. Okay, anyway, so these are the kinds of questions we can use these materials to answer. And I'm going to skip that and just say, if I back up to where I started, the big question, I think I'm pursuing this consilience challenge of trying to bring these records. So my argument is that once those avocado IT records get into an archive's hands, and the time constraints lapse and people can write about it, we will have established consilience, because these same records that people are using now for social science will then be used for history. We'll be able to talk about the same firms using the same records. This anti-Whig history, is this the best we can hope for? Or will Christine Borgman come and kind of bail us out? Can we change policy in some way to create that public interest in these private records? And then finally, just about email. It's the original killer app, but how long will it be useful? As we move to Slack and a lot of firms in the cloud, it may be that 2015, 2017, 2020, at some point email will stop being the coin of the realm and we'll need to find a new one. But I'm going to suggest that at least for this time window that I've been looking at, these early internet firms, etc., email's been pretty important. So there you go. I think I'm done. I'm over. Thank you very much, and look forward to your comments.